Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you about 5 books that I would like to reread. Now, I'm really not a rereader. I am one of those people who's like, there's so many books out there that I want to read. I can't be wasting time reading books that I've already experienced when there are so many new books out there. And like, I know that that's a silly way to think because it's not a waste of time if you're enjoying it. And chances are, if it's a book that you want to reread, then it's a favourite book, so you obviously are going to enjoy it. I think as readers we really evolve with really every single book that we read. Just in like our general lives we evolve, so you're going to bring a slightly different version of yourself to a reread than you did the first time around, and you could get different things out of it. You could get different things out of it because you know where these characters end up. And recently I reread Normal People by Sally Rooney, which was my favourite book of 2018. And that's totally the experience I had with that book. You know, I got different things from it because I knew where these characters ended up. I brought a slightly different version of myself to it this time around than I did the first time around. So I'm going to share with you some books that I think I would have the same experience with if I were to reread them. Whether or not I actually end up rereading them in the near future is another thing, but I would like to. I would say all of these books were definitely favourite books in the year that I read them, although for some of them I didn't like compile a favourite books of the year list in the years that I read them, but I am going to talk about them in the order that I read them. Starting with The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. I think I probably read this when I was about 16. It was after a period where I hadn't really been reading much whatsoever, and I really wanted that to change. I really wanted to be a bookish person again. Like, I was a really bookish child, and then kind of in my early teens I didn't really read all that much, and this was one of the books that massively got me back into reading. I had never read anything like it before. I absolutely adored it. This is a novel that is set in Nazi Germany, and we are predominantly following a little girl named Liesel. Throughout the course of this novel, Liesel steals a number of books, and I think Liesel's love for books and writing was something that really ignited the same thing in me. And also what I found fascinating about this book was the fact it is narrated by Death, and I found Death to be just such an interesting perspective to tell this story from. I would be intrigued to reread this because I've obviously read so much more since reading this, and now I would consider myself someone who isn't really into wartime fiction. I remember this book being mind-blowing. I remember it being such a masterpiece, and it would be intriguing to see if I still feel the same way about it on a reread. I would also really love to reread The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Now, I read this book when I was, I think, probably 18 or 19, which I think is kind of the time where a lot of people end up reading this novel. I'd read a bit of Sylvia Plath's poetry in school, and I had a really interesting relationship with it in that it was, when it came to writing essays about poetry, Plath was one of the poets that I struggled to write about the most. And I remember like my teacher commenting on that and saying, you clearly don't like Plath as much as you like these other poets. But it was totally the other way round. I felt like I connected with Plath so much that I didn't know how to articulate what I was feeling. I wasn't able to kind of objectively analyse it in the same way I was with other poets because I felt such a like emotional connection to it. And I think when you're that kind of age, you're dealing with so many emotions that you've never dealt with before. You do feel like constantly you're in the middle of a breakdown. I had like dreadful mental health at that point in my life as well, and I think I found a lot of kinship with Sylvia Plath. In saying that, I really don't remember much about this novel. I remember the experience and my connection to it and my emotional response, but I don't actually remember all that much about what happens in the novel. I've also underlined loads of stuff in this book, so it would be intriguing to see what 18, 19-year-old me thought was important about this. Next, I'd like to reread Nina Is Not Okay by Shappi Khorsandi. This is a book that divides opinions a lot, but it's one that I absolutely devoured. I think I was about 20 when I read this. There's a lot of really difficult and harrowing experiences in this book. It deals with very brutal sexual assault, and it deals with our teenage protagonist's alcohol addiction. We follow this character as she grapples with her own trauma and struggling to understand what has happened to her. She goes down this just really destructive path. I've never read a book about a young adult that dealt with these things so sort of explicitly. What I really loved about this book as well was the bisexual representation in it. I myself identify as queer, although if you wanted to specify that a little bit more, I do feel quite comfortable with the term bisexual, but it's something that I'm still like confused about on a regular basis. That's why I like the term queer, because it's like, I'm just not straight. How our main character comes to understand her sexuality in this book was something that I felt a lot of kinship with. Saying all of that, since reading it, some of my friends who I think I have quite similar reading tastes to have read this and really not liked it. So I do wonder if it was a case of like, right book, right time, and if I came to it now, I maybe wouldn't like it so much. It's really interesting to think about these things. Next, we have The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss. I think I was probably about 20 when I read this as well, and I think that reading year I still think of as one of the best reading years I've ever had in terms of like reading favourite books. And I definitely still consider this one of my favourite books. This follows a father coming to terms with the fact that his daughter went through this kind of inexplicable medical emergency where her heart stopped beating. She is fine, but he still experiences so much fear and anxiety as a result of that. You just follow him in the months after that happening, trying to come to terms with it. And I think this was a book that really changed how I felt about my own parents. I think it made me understand how protective my own parents felt about me, and that was kind of a perspective that I'd never read before. I think Sarah Moss is just one of the most incredible, beautiful writers ever as well. I've read a couple of her books since reading this, and I have her new novel, Summer Water, on my shelf to read quite soon. And I just think she's incredible. And finally, we have a book that I read last year, and that is Almost Love by Louise O'Neill. Louise O'Neill is one of my favourite writers of all time. I have absolutely devoured all of her books, and I cannot wait to read her new novel. But this was her first novel for adults that came out last year. This book focuses on Sarah, who seems to have a lot of difficulty in her personal relationships. She has a really, really great boyfriend, but she doesn't seem to appreciate him at all. She has quite an antagonist relationship with his mother. She just seems like a really not pleasant person. But we also flick back into her past and find out the root of some of the ways that she isn't a particularly easy person to get along with is because of a relationship she had with a man who was 20 years her senior. I will always love books that depict these kind of female experiences, trying to come to terms with who you are, struggling with power dynamics in relationships. I've never been in a relationship or like situationship with someone that much older than me. I've definitely been in relationships where the power dynamics are like, there's just completely different levels of power. We see Sarah exhibiting some really unhealthy and toxic behaviours throughout this book. But it's so, for me anyway, and this is something I've heard from other people who've read this book, it can be so uncomfortable to read because you've been through that, you've behaved like that as well. And when you see someone else doing it, or when you've come through the other side of doing those behaviours, you're just willing her not to go down this path. But of course she does, because we all did. I put so many sticky tabs in this book, and again, like with the bell jar, I think it would be so interesting to reread this and see what was important to me on my first read of this book. So there we have it, 5 books that I would like to reread. If you want to find out more about these books, I will of course leave them linked down below in the description. Leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books before, or let me know which books you are most excited to reread. I'd love to have a chat with you guys down in the comments. I hope you're doing well and staying safe, and I will talk to you in my next video.